Okay, so I'm still in the library. It's still very late at night, so I'm trying to be quiet. But another book that I wanted to talk about is One Last Word by Nikki Grimes. This is a book of poetry, and for this book, she won the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award. Um, yeah, so this book is super awesome. The artwork in here is really cool too. I'll kind of flip through and show you some pages, but let's first talk about what this book is about. Basically, this book is a collection of poems. They're all written in the same style. They're all written in golden shovel style, which I'll explain in just a minute. And Nikki incorporates her own poems as well as poems from really popular artists during the Harlem Renaissance, and she kind of uses the Harlem Renaissance poets' themes as inspiration for her poems, and she uses lines from their poems as the basis for her poems, which I'll explain a little bit more in just a little bit. But Nikki Grimes is a modern poet. She's still alive today. She grew up in Queens. She is an African American woman, and so this book has a lot to do on themes and things that are issues for people of color in America, both in the past and current day issues. One thing that I found interesting was that Nikki Grimes uses a lot of poems by Gwendolyn Bennett. Gwendolyn Bennett is a Harlem Renaissance poet. She wrote a ton of poetry during the Harlem Renaissance and was kind of an activist and part of the civil rights movement, but she also was a painter, which I think is cool. So if you have some time, you should look up Gwendolyn Bennett's paintings. She was a fantastic artist. She used a lot of acrylic paints, which I like to use acrylic paints when I paint, so that was kind of a fun little tidbit. Anyway, so let's talk first about golden shovel poetry. In the beginning of this book, Nikki Grimes gives us, thankfully, I'm grateful that she did this, she gives us kind of an introduction to what golden shovel poetry is. So golden shovel, let me see where she explains. The idea of a golden shovel poem is to take a short poem in its entirety or a line from that poem, called a striking line, and create a new poem using the words from the original. Say you decide to use a single line, you would arrange that line word by word in the right margin. And then she kind of sets up the page to show us what she means. So these words right here say in the right margin. Then you would write a new poem, each line ending in one of these words. In the example above, that would mean the first line of the new poem would end with the word in. The second line would end with the word the, and so on. So then she kind of shows us an example of a poem that she would write if the words that she started with were in the right margin. So the poem she wrote as an example was, I wake and shake off the morning as mom tiptoes in. Rise and shine, she whispers, always the same old song, get up, right now. I groan on cue, but she gives me no margin. So what Nikki does throughout this book is she takes lines from poems written by the Harlem Renaissance poets, and she uses those as the striking line to start her own golden shovel poetry. So the striking line is the last word, the line that you use to create the last word in each line of the new poem. So I thought this was a really cool picture. Let me just show you this for a minute. All the artwork in this book is really, really awesome. But some of the things that I wanted to talk about with this book is that it kind of provides a counter narrative. I like that it compares and contrasts Harlem Renaissance poets with a more modern poet. Nikki Grimes herself is the modern poet. I think it's really cool that we're comparing how the issues facing Harlem Renaissance poets are still facing African American poets today, and not even just poets, just African Americans in general, and how those issues still are present in our world today. I think it's interesting that even though we think we've come a long way since the Harlem Renaissance, the issues are still the same The stereotypes are still the same. The preconceived notions are still the same. There's still racism in the world. We haven't quite gotten rid of it yet. But this book kind of breaks down those assumptions and gives us a view into what it actually feels like to be an African American and what it actually, how those stereotypes affect people, how those preconceived notions affect people, how that slow progress of getting rid of racism and segregation is affecting people. So I think it's really interesting because it's an inside look into the life of an African American woman. And she doesn't always write from her perspective. Sometimes she has characters in her poems that she writes through their perspectives. I'll show you one in a minute that kind of caught my attention because it's written from a young man's perspective, and Nikki Grimes is not a young man. Anyway, so one of the things we were asked to do with this book as I was reading it was pick out a poem that challenged or dismantled oppression. And I came across a poem. It's titled A Dark Date for Josh, and this is one of Nikki Grimes' poems. So on the pages in this book, sorry, got distracted for a minute. On the pages in this poem, so this page is the poem Common Dust, written by Georgia Douglas Johnson. She is a Harlem Renaissance poet. And then this poem is what's used to create Nikki Grimes's Golden Shovel poem, which is on the next page. And you'll see that Nikki has bolded the last word of each line in her poem that she created. So you can compare this to the previous page with the older inspiration poem. So this poem that caught my attention the most out of all the ones in this book is called A Dark Date for Josh. Nikki Grimes wrote it. And basically the premise of this poem is that a boy named Josh, who we are assuming that he is Caucasian, comes home one night and tells his mom that he's taking Tanisha to the prom. We assume that Tanisha is an African American woman that he's going to take to prom as his prom date. And his mother right away has this negative reaction. She says, "You shall not." And Josh kind of reflects and thinks about all the things that his mom has taught him about how we need to treat everybody equally, and all of our blood is red, is one of the things that he points out. And so he gets really upset about that. Later in the poem, Josh and his mom and his dad are all sitting at the dinner table, and his dad can tell that something's kind of off. There's some tension in the air, so he questions Josh about it. Josh tells him, "I'm taking Tanisha to the prom." And mom doesn't like that. And Josh's dad was like, "Well, I think that's great." And I'm trying to find the line. So Josh's dad says, "I don't understand. Is the girl an axe murderer? Do you know her to be of low morals? What?" And Josh kind of exhales and he feels some relief because his dad's kind of making a joke out of why his mom would be upset about it. Like, there's nothing wrong with Tanisha. We've never met her. How would you know if she's, not an acceptable prom date? And so the conclusion of the poem basically is just that Josh's mom comes and apologizes for what she says, and Josh is really excited to take Tanisha to the prom, and they both feel like it's a first step. So I thought that this poem specifically was really interesting because it talks about interracial relationships. And I find that topic interesting because I think a lot of times I hear stories of Caucasian families having issue with their children being in relationships with people of color. And I think that dynamic is interesting because a lot of parents obviously teach their children, yes, we should treat everyone with kindness and respect, and we shouldn't separate ourselves by race. And people are aware that we need to teach our children those things, but yet they still have bias and prejudice that they're not quite aware of until a situation comes up where they kind of say something negative and surprise themselves. So I thought that was really interesting, and I think that poem kind of challenges oppression and shows a very real life situation that we can all imagine, having this conversation at the dinner table with our mom and dad, and how moms and dads sometimes make mistakes and say things that they don't necessarily mean or believe. So I thought that was super interesting. This book provides a really awesome platform for discussion. There are poems in here that talk about discrimination and how African American people are treated differently than their Caucasian peers. There are poems in here that talk about overcoming obstacles, the obstacles that African American people face every day, whether that was in the past or in our current society. There are poems in here that talk about survival and being poor and hungry and having that be an issue that African American people are facing. There are poems in here about activism and things that are hopeful, and there are a couple poems in here that talk about African American women loving their bodies, and I think right now we're in this state of kind of a women's uprising. That might sound like a negative term. I don't mean it in a negative way. But women are kind of having their moment in history right now where we're kind of standing up for ourselves and saying, no, we're going to love our body no matter what it looks like, and we're going to do our best to support each other. And there are some poems in here talking specifically about the struggles that African American women might face about loving their body, and feeling sexy and confident and owning their sexuality, which is a controversial topic for all women right now. But I think it's super interesting that we can kind of see it through the lens of, how would this feel if we weren't Caucasian, if we were an African American woman. So I think this book is eye-opening for people who are not of color. I think it's relatable for people who are of color. And I think it's just a really awesome way, one, to introduce books of poetry because it's relatable, it's really easy to read. Sometimes when I hand students books of poetry, they stare at me like, Miss Luck, are you kidding? I'm not going to read a book all of poetry. But it's not convoluted poetry. It's not difficult to read. So I think that this book is a really awesome way to kind of dip your toe into reading poetry. It's also really cool because you don't see a lot of golden shovel poems. It's not the most common form of poetry. So I think it's awesome that a lot of these poems in here are written in that golden shovel style. The art in here is absolutely stunning. And every page has a poem and then some sort of art, pretty much. It's separated into 4 parts. The 4 parts have different overarching themes. I'm trying to find the picture for the poem that I was talking about, A Dark Day for Josh. This is that picture. Just really pretty watercolor representation of Josh and his prom date, Tanisha. And yeah, so that's pretty much all I wanted to say about this book. I really enjoyed reading it. I think it's an awesome way to look at multiple perspectives from one group of people. I think it's a really awesome way to bring up a lot of different issues with race discrimination in our country. I think it's an interesting linear story between what was happening during the Harlem Renaissance and how those issues are still lingering now, how they've morphed a little bit and changed. But overall, super awesome book. I highly recommend it. And Nikki Grimes is an awesome poet and awesome author. She has some other things, and watching interviews with her is super, super cool. So I really like that. One Last Word by Nikki Grimes.